Hello and welcome everyone to this episode of the Afghanistan podcast. Joining me today, I have Professor David Gibbs from University of Arizona, USA. David is a professor of history specializing in U.S. foreign policy, foreign interventions, and empire building. So, without further ado, let me say, David, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you, David. David, I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'd like us to talk about um, West Asia as a region, the Middle East, but specifically to do with Israel, historic development of relations between U.S., Israel, and the whole region. Before we get into that, would you like to take? I know you've authored many books on U.S. foreign policy. Would you like to take some time to maybe talk about one or two recent books that you've got? But also, can you tell us about your own stance? About U.S. foreign policy, U.S. intervention, especially in this region. That will help us get started.
All right. I've written on a lot of regions of the world. I've written a great deal on Afghanistan over many years. I wrote a book on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a second book on the breakup of Yugoslavia, mostly in both cases all these cases emphasizing the issue of foreign intervention and militarism, especially covert intervention. I have a very special interest in covert intervention by intelligence services, especially the CIA. I should add that's partly because of my background. My doctorate is in political science from MIT, and MIT's political science department has historically had very close connections to the Central Intelligence Agency, something I didn't realize until later. And my third book, which just came out recently, actually is on U.S. domestic politics, particularly the issue of wealth concentration and the politics of wealth concentration. This is it. It's called Revolt of the Rich. It's and a lot of it concerns foreign policy, how basically in the 1970s, you had a retrenchment of U.S. foreign policy, a certain reluctance by the public to intervene because of the fiasco of Vietnam, and then a tremendous business-directed lobby effort to change that and to turn the clock back in a much more interventionist direction to raise the military budget. I point out this had a very important effect on domestic politics because it lowered living standards. It diverted money from social programs into militarism. You might say there was the classic trade-off between guns and butter in the late 70s. You also had the options of choosing guns or butter, and it chose guns. And so it contributed to the overarching and corporate-funded redistribution of wealth upwards in the United States, the lowering of living standards for working-class people in the United States. That was my last book. I'm working on a new project now that deals further with that into the post-Cold War period called Guns, Butter, and the Politics of Permanent War. And I'm researching it at this time.
Interesting. Have you also studied, written about how U.S. interventions have evolved over time? So from Vietnam, when there's a big backlash from all the bodies that were coming back, to then going into a situation where U.S. is kind of involved in just kind of aerial attacks, so they can kind of um, have warfare, but without the loss of human lives on their part. But then it kind of seems to have evolved even from there, where it's just like you said, it's like COVID kind of intervention, economic sanctions, kind of what's happened in Syria.
That's right.
Yeah. So have you talked about that? How do you see that, especially in this region?
Well, to some extent, I deal with this in my most recent book, which is the issue of, as I said, the trauma of Vietnam. I should add, Vietnam was much more of a trauma. The Vietnam War was a bigger trauma for the people of Vietnam, but it was also a trauma for the U.S. foreign policy elite, in the sense that they were very discredited. People who aren't as old as I am, who don't remember that period, don't fully realize what a fiasco that really was and how that changed public opinion, and led to a great deal of distrust of institutions. In some sense, you might say Donald Trump is the long-term effect of that, and that he's an anti-system politician who has contempt for existing standards of conduct, including in foreign policy. And to some extent, you might say the change in public opinion in a much more critical direction. This did have its beginning with the fiasco of Vietnam. And this discredited a whole generation of foreign policy personnel. And I think it really transformed U.S. foreign policy. And as I said, it led to a backlash at the elite level, resulting in Well, one of the effects of that backlash was U.S. support for Israel. Israel was seen as an inspiration for what U.S. foreign policy should be. Israel used force unapologetically, never apologized for the use of force. It seemed to mostly, not always, but mostly disdain negotiations, and used force not defensively but aggressively, offensively. And at least in the mythology, this isn't really true in practice, but in the mythology, it always wins. That's the mythology anyway. And so I think all of this was very instructive for U.S. foreign policy. And so just leading into, I think, what will be our larger topic for today.
So how, David, how has this relationship evolved between USA and Israel over time? Because as far as I know, it wasn't always so kind of codependent and and so close. But recently, and I paraphrase, but Joe Biden was saying, is if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create an Israel for our foreign policy.
Yeah.
So how did we get here over the past maybe 5 decades or so?
Good question. It's worth noting and emphasizing it's not really true the U.S. has always been a staunch, reliable supporter of Israel. That's not quite true. Israel was founded in 1948 with very strong U.S. diplomatic backing from President Truman. But also, again, people forget this, from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a very positive image of Israel. And the main supporter of Israel in terms of weapons was the Soviet Union and newly communist Czechoslovakia. That alliance did not last very long. And Israel distanced itself from the Soviet Union, which resulted in a kind of backlash in the Soviet Union domestically. There was an anti-Semitic campaign.
When did
Stalin
this
became
happen?
quite paranoid. I'm sorry?
When did this happen? Around what time?
Shortly after the 48 war, Israel began to distance itself from the Soviet Union, albeit so that is in gratitude, which in a sense, I suppose you could say it was. They had funneled arms into Israel for the 48 war, which Israel effectively won. And then Israel began trying to look for what they saw as different and better allies. And so there was an anti-Semitic campaign just before Stalin died. In 1953, he died of natural causes. But one of the issues was that he saw his Jewish doctors as conspiring against him. There seems to be some authentic paranoia. The doctor's plot, it was called. And in any case, Israel found a new ally in the form of France. France was Israel's main political supporter, as well as Israel's supplier of weapons up until the late 60s. Israel's entire air force had been built in France for the 1967 war. The relations were very close. People forget this. Were very close, so much so that France basically helped Israel launch its nuclear program, the Dimona Nuclear Research Station in the Negev, which is still the main source of Israel's nuclear weapons. That was built by France in the 1950s. When France itself was developing nuclear weapons, they were doing so in some degree of cooperation with Israel. There's almost joint development going on here. I'm sorry, can you hear me? We just had a pause. Is okay?
No, I can. Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Fine. And in any case, France Charles de Gaulle began to realize that the Arab world would be a better and more important ally than Israel, and began turning away from Israel after the 1967 war. And this was the time when the United States was effectively losing in Vietnam. The big turning point in Vietnam was the 1968 Tet Offensive, when the Viet Cong launched this massive offensive, gaining much greater military initiative than anybody thought possible. And it was after the Tet Offensive that really public support for the war began to collapse. And in this context, Richard Nixon was elected president in a very narrow election, assumed office in January 1969. And Nixon and Kissinger, working very closely with Kissinger, developed the Nixon Doctrine, which was predicated on the idea that the public would not support direct U.S. intervention with U.S. forces anymore. And that the military had been so discredited, they had to reduce military spending, which Nixon did. The first time in the Cold War, substantially reduced military spending. Nixon didn't really want to do this. I don't think he was a man of peace. He never defined himself that way, but he was a realist and also a political realist in the sense that he realized the public had to be appeased. America's a democracy, after all. We have elections here. And so appeasement to the public was what was the name of the game. So in that light, he reduced military spending, did reduce direct military intervention, although he increased intervention by the CIA, which is perfect because it's not done with regular U.S. forces, and it's done in secret. Nixon prized secrecy very highly. But the most important feature of it was to find regional allies in various parts of the world, who America would arm to the teeth and would train their forces, but they would fight for American interests. And the key allies were selected in various places. The two most important of these allies were the Shah of Iran in the Persian Gulf and Israel. And Israel began to get the latest American weapons, not nuclear. They had to do that themselves, having already essentially, it's believed that Israel developed nuclear weapons, operational ones, probably in 1967. But nevertheless, Nixon would give them just about everything else non-nuclear. And unlike the French, who sold them the weapons on commercial terms, Nixon began to subsidize Israel's acquisition of weapons on a massive scale. This was a new feature. And the logic of it was, people tend to explain American support for Israel by reference to the Israel lobby. And that's one factor. These policies like this never occur because of only one factor. There's several factors. One is, in light of the trauma of Vietnam, Nixon needed new allies, and Israel was seen as militarily effective. It just won the war in 1967 against its Arab neighbors. And the way that what they would say in Washington was that, in South Vietnam, we gave the South Vietnamese weapons and they didn't know what to do with them. The communist forces ran circles around them. But in Israel, if we give them the weapons, they'll know what to do with the weapons. They'll use them effectively. And so it was a massive flow of weapons, more than the French gave, more advanced than the French gave, that were subsidized, to some extent given for free. And this enabled Israel to become a relatively high-income country and still have outsized military forces, and to always live in a permanent state of semi-warfare. And, whether this was good for Israel or not is debatable, but they saw it as good for them. And they developed a military doctrine, which was very much admired increasingly by the United States, of relentless use of force over negotiations as much as possible, and a military strategy that emphasized attack, not defense. And again, if you're a military person, if you've gone to one of these service academies in the US or in Europe or in Pakistan, I'm sure it's the same thing. There's always a certain admiration for offensive warfare. A weak officer defends, a real strong officer attacks. And Israel had an attack orientation. And that was seen in a very positive light. And so you did have it definitely at an Israel lobby. It was massive and extremely influential. John Mearsheimer and Stefan Walt have written an excellent book on this. That's very accurate. Of course, it was anchored especially in the Jewish community, the Jewish community wasn't 100% pro-Israel until the 1967 war. The 1967 war changed everything. And American Jews solidly backed Israel and poured money into the Israel lobby, especially AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, one of the most important lobbies in Washington. But it wasn't quite as simple as saying it was just the Israel lobby, because in a sense they were pushing on an open door. Even without the Israel lobby, Nixon was already predisposed to support Israel on the grounds that the U.S. needed an ally in the Middle East, and Israel was effective. One more thing that has to be mentioned, there's more to it than just the Jewish community, which is this was a period, the 70s. So there was an upsurge of interest in evangelical Christianity, called America's Fourth Great Awakening. Periodically, there are these cycles of interest in evangelicalism, which involves kind of literalist interpretations of the New Testament. And this is a huge part of the American public. In the 70s, I think, about a third of the public identified as evangelical. I think the defining feature is being identified as having been born again in Christ. And evangelicals developed a new doctrine, which was Christian Zionism, becoming almost more pro-Zionist than the Jews. Some of them were.
But outside of that, like really bizarre, but it's so true.
Yeah. In a sense, I suppose that from the outside, you could look at it as bizarre. I'm reluctant to make value judgments because I'm not Christian. I don't, at a gut level, understand it, but other people do. And, they have their reasons, I suppose, but whether for better or worse, they saw Israel as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
Yeah. That
the founding of the Jewish state anticipated the Armageddon War, which would take place in the Middle East, and the second coming of Jesus Christ. And all Christians and America as a Christian country, and they saw America as a Christian country despite the U.S. Constitution. America had a religious obligation to back Israel forcefully, without compromise. And they developed also.
So evangelical Christians, is that from any particular denomination, or what is an evangelical Christian?
It's a good question. Most of what we're talking about here are Protestants, although there has been an evangelical tendency in Catholicism as well, but mostly it's Protestants. It grew up among Protestants. And the idea was it's separated from the mainstream Protestants. In other words, mainstream ones like Presbyterians, Methodists, who are seen as not having a literalist enough interpretation of the New Testament. And what you had in the 70s were sort of storefront churches with ministers who often didn't have official certifications, but would establish large congregations of people who were very emotional kind of Christianity, a very emotional relationship, and a literalist interpretation of Scripture. And this became immensely popular, especially among working class people. And not only working class whites, also there's a very strong evangelical tendency among African Americans that's very significant. It's wrong to think that people tend to think of them as the Christian right. That's not completely true. Black Christians tend not to be right wing, so it's a little bit more complicated. One shouldn't stereotype them and simplify. But in any case, one thing many of them did have in common is a very strong commitment to Christian Zionism. Now, obviously, has enormous importance from a foreign policy standpoint, because Jews were in the 70s only 3% of the population. I think now they're only 2%. They didn't have that many votes. Yeah. And evangelical Christians, that was a much larger voting bloc. And so that too influenced Nixon, who was courting the evangelical Christians. That was a big part of his political base. And so Nixon forged a new kind of politics. One is he fundamentally changed America's relationship with Israel in a way that proved enduring. Also, he brought the Republican Party and evangelical Christians together, which again had very important implications for Israel. And I should say that Jewish groups had some trepidation because evangelical Christians did have some tradition of anti-Semitism, but they set that aside in the interest of realpolitik, that these are allies and you don't and powerful allies, and they were very interested in that. And
I'll ask one question here, actually, that comes to mind. So often we hear that the public isn't so interested in foreign policy or what's happening outside of the borders of America. They are more concerned about bread and butter issues like you were talking about before. Right. So how did it happen that so the evangelical Christians that we're talking about like people in the public, how did they become so interested in kind of this support for this kind of alliance with Zionism?
As far as I could tell, it was organic. It came directly out of ministers who began for the first time in the 70s during this evangelical upsurge, insisting that Israel was fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And I think Jewish groups
it's more a religious thing at that point than a geopolitical thing.
Oh, definitely. Well, there was something else too, which is evangelical Christians were very anti-communist. And so communist is atheism, which it was, of course, mostly anyway. Yeah. And so they were very hostile to communism on those grounds. Also, there was, it gets very complicated. There was enormous coalition building in America behind what's called now neoliberalism, free market economics, that was funded massively by corporate interests. What you had was the building up of an alliance at the elite level. And the alliance included sort of business conservatives, mostly very, very rich. Then you had militarists, the military-industrial complex, another element, you might say, of business conservatives with a special niche interest. They made common cause with them. And finally, you needed votes. And elites, by definition, don't have that many votes. And so there was cultural conservatism, cultural traditionalism, a reaction against the cultural changes of the 60s, a reaction against pornography, nudity in films, abortion rights, homosexuality, these kinds of things. Evangelical Christians were very negative on those issues. And so the business-oriented right wing brought into their coalition cultural conservatism and religious conservatism, even though many of these wealthy people weren't themselves religious. Again, this is about alliance.
It's interesting what you're saying, because they remind me so much about what happened with Salafism coming out of Saudi Arabia.
In what country are you referring here?
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. Saudi Arabia and like the Salafi movement coming out, kind of ignoring some of the politics that were going on inside of Saudi Arabia, but more interested in making sure that they can have like religious um, purity backed by state apparatus that they can spread around the world. So it seems to me a little bit similar what's going on.
I hadn't thought of that analogy, but I see your point. There may very well be something there. Politics is about coalitions. I'm a little bit skeptical of people who find one single cause for things. It's usually multiple causes coming together.
Yeah.
And that's what you had here.
Mm.
And in the case of Israel, the implication of that was key elements of this coalition were strong supporters of Israel. The military-industrial complex, as I said, saw Israel as a model for what America should do, which, of course, if the U.S. engages in militarist policies like Israel, increasing the military budget, that's what they wanted. Also, arms sales to Israel, that's a good thing, especially because the United States became increasingly very anxious about how the loss of the war in Vietnam was damaging U.S. arms sales. The biggest beneficiary had been France, ironically. France had a huge boom in sales, especially of fighter planes, because they didn't lose the war in Vietnam like we lost the war in Vietnam. The U.S. could compensate for that by having Israel buy some fighter planes. They bought quite a few fighter planes, in fact, subsidized by U.S. taxpayers, no less, which wasn't a problem because that was very beneficial to the interests involved. So there was this broad coalition. And what it did do is it endured through the Cold War. And the problem is once you establish vested interests surrounding some project like America's support for Israel, it's very hard to dismantle. And even after the Cold War was over and it served its purpose, dismantling this coalition was impossible. And so you had all these people, Jews as well as evangelical Christians, and the military-industrial complex that continued to push for U.S. support for Israel. I should add something else that the United States did under Nixon, which is very significant. In the 1973 war, Israel did not win that war decisively. It very nearly lost the war altogether. On the second day, Israeli leaders were panicking. They eventually sort of won, but not decisively like they had in 1967. And during that war, the United States bailed them out. The United States, Israel didn't have stockpiles of weapons. Didn't have enough money to do that. The U.S. had the stockpiles. So the U.S. began flying in weapons through giant transport planes to resupply Israel and to give Israel the psychological support they needed to prevail. And therefore enabled Israel to ultimately gain the upper hand on the battlefield. But it also set a precedent that if Israel gets into another war and needs to be bailed out, America will bail them out, as we did in this recent war. Yeah. After the October 7th, 2023 attacks, which were really horrific, the United States didn't just increase its financial support for Israel, it sent naval forces to intercept missiles and so on. We bailed Israel out once again. That precedent was set during Nixon. Once you set a precedent, it's very hard to break the precedent. It just keeps going.
David, it's so interesting, that entire kind of historic evolution that you've talked about. I was actually surprised. So we talked about the important allies of Israel since its inception, and there's Russia, France, and then America. And I was surprised that Britain didn't get mentioned in that whole. Was Britain not so important for Israel at that point?
Israel did receive British tanks. The Centurion tank became Israel's most widely used tank. It's a British tank. And they were sold on commercial terms to Israel. But you didn't really have... The thing Israel emphasized most heavily was fighter planes. Those were French. And the tank forces were secondary in terms of military strategy. And the very close political backing that France gave, Britain didn't really give to that extent. The support for Israel's nuclear weapons development, that was entirely France that did that. And so Israel's relationship with also Germany, West Germany sold Israel tanks as well. But so it wasn't just France, but France really was Israel's main backer. I should add this is a little bit surprising because, of course, all three countries, France, Britain, and Israel, colluded in the 1956 war, invading Egypt. And that was one of the reasons you developed this very close French-Israeli connection, was the lead up to the 1956 war. But for some reason, that did not translate into such close political relations between Israel and Britain as it did with France.
That's interesting to know. Yeah. And it's also interesting. So the two wars that you mentioned, the Vietnam War and the 1965 War of Israel and its
67.
neighbors, 67, sorry. That was like pivotal, and the fact that those two events happened so closely
That's right. That's right.
has shaped so much of history. Then O- a lot of people talk about when we're talking about relations between USA and Israel, a lot of people are asking who is in control in that relationship. Does USA control Israel or does Israel control USA? But I'd like to ask a question maybe slightly differently. Who's benefited more or in this relationship over the past few decades? Who's benefited more?
It depends how you define benefit. In terms of power, I guess you could say both countries benefit, which is why they do it. In the larger sense of benefit, it's very hard to see what the benefit is. Israel is less secure on account of its policies in very obvious ways. The attacks of October 7th, which killed 1,200 Israelis, both military and civilian, were horrible attacks, but they didn't come out of nowhere. People pretend they came out of nowhere. They didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of the fact that Israel has this strict, brutal control of the occupied territories, which are occupied illegally according to international law. And that's where they came from. Israel would have been better off, in my view, safer, more secure, if it had opted for a two-state solution, which it effectively rejected. It's quite ironic because the whole logic of Israel, ideologically, was a safe haven for Jews. It's far safer for Jews to be living in the United States, or even safer, probably, ironically enough, in Germany. They're the old nemesis of the Jews in Germany, which is safer than the US because there are fewer guns, far safer than Israel. So the ideological justification doesn't seem that compelling. And so it's hard to see how Israel benefits from this policy of militarism. As for the United States, well, the US itself is also a target for terrorism. The 9/11 terrorist attacks that brought down the World Trade Center killed 3,000 people. There's no doubt that one of the reasons bin Laden cited, and there's no doubt he meant it, I don't think there's any reason to think he's lying, was because the US is backing Israel. And as a Muslim, he was offended by that. And that's hardly surprising. He was offended by that. And the militarism that has generally been associated with US policy has diverted money that have from social programs. It's lowered living standards. We've been favoring guns over butter. So you could say the American public has not benefited from that. So it depends on who you ask. On the other hand, there is no doubt vested interests associated with the weapons manufacturing sector have benefited immensely from this project. So does the US benefit or Israel benefit? I suppose it depends on which part of Israel and which part of the United States you tend to look at.
It's also really interesting to see with this new Trump administration, um, to what extent are they kind of departing from previous administrations in their foreign policy? Um, it's clear in the war in Ukraine,
Yes.
but when it comes to the Middle East, it's a lot of like the same as before, but maybe even doubling down even more to some extent. But then you do see um, uh, signs of the contrary as well. For example, Trump doing a deal with Yemen that kind of excludes
That's
Israel,
right.
and these negotiations going on between USA and Iran,
Mhm.
which to some extent Israel's not happy with. So, how do you, from a historic point of view, how do you see the role of the current administration? Do you think it's like a continuation of the past, or do you think there's an actual departure?
I do think, in general, I think there's an actual departure in a sense that I think Trump is okay with an abdication of unipolarity, of US dominance. And that's the way he's acting. And to some extent, even some of his officials are saying that we're seeing basically the move to multipolarity. No American president would have ever accepted that previously. Biden never would have accepted that, even though it's obviously happening. I think what you're seeing, it's very hard to really make definitive judgments about what's going on because things are so much in flux. What you're seeing here is both in American politics and global politics, a fundamental realignment of everything. US politics has changed fundamentally in the last 10 years with the advent of Donald Trump in a way they'll never be going back. And what stable system will replace it, I think, is almost anybody's guess at this point. And I think that's true of the international situation as well. We've had the system of unipolarity since 1945, and that's coming to an end. And what is going to replace it? Will it be a dominance by China? Will it be a multilateral dominance by the BRIC states collectively? Or will we see a return to truly global dominance, maybe with a resurgence of the United Nations? I don't have an answer to that. But what we are going to see is things will be different. The thing about Trump that's very interesting is massive inconsistency and a willingness to change on a dime, which again makes prediction very difficult.
Yeah.
One thing, you are correct that on Israel, he tends to show more consistency than in Ukraine, where he's been all over the map. I think one of the things you're seeing is that the base of the Republican Party is more pro-Israel at this point.
Yeah.
Support for Israel is eroding day by day in the United States. Public opinion polls are showing that, but it's still substantial. Decades of public relations by the Israel lobby and decades of support by the American government have had a PR effect in the public that Israel is somehow a better country than anyone else in the Middle East. That's the perception, in spite of everything. That one hates to put it this way, and nobody wants to say this publicly because it sounds ugly, but there's a perception of the United States Israel is more like us.
Yeah.
That
Definitely. Yeah.
the Arab states are not like us in a very negative way, and you might say that's racist, and it is racist, but leave that aside. I mean, I think that is how it is seen in the United States, and that is more common. I'm sorry. Do you want to say something?
No, I was actually just going to ask about that as well. That what role does public opinion and the press play in terms of Americans' policy toward Israel? Because as you say, it is shifting, but how much is that likely to
Yeah, good
change
question.
actual policy?
Mostly, I don't think public opinion matters that much in policy. I mean, there've been study after study showing that in domestic policy and even more in foreign policy, there's a divergence between what the public wants and what they get, indicating that despite elections, the democratic character of the policymaking process isn't that compelling. I do think that there's no constraint. In other words, I think what you have here is there's some constraint, at least in the Republican side, in that public support for Israel is significantly stronger among Republicans than among Democrats. And I think that reflects the evangelical element, which is overwhelmingly Republican, which remains Christian Zionist.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big factor. I think Republican elites reflect that as well, in that both parties are overwhelmingly pro-Israel. There's no doubt about this. But I think the Republicans may lean even a little bit more that way than the Democrats, at least these days. That wasn't always true, by the way. Eisenhower had a very arm's length relationship with Israel and leaned more towards the Arab states, I would say. In the 1956 war, of course, he demanded Israel and France and Britain withdraw from the Sinai. The Republican Party now is solidly pro-Israel.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Trump has this ideology called America First, and it is a nationalist ideology. And we're seeing it again and again, including things like tariffs. I mean, nobody ever heard of tariffs for decades in the United States, and now suddenly they come roaring back in a big way, in an ideological way. Again, in my lifetime, I haven't seen that. That references a much earlier period of American history. And so I think what you have this is America First ideology. And I think, at least at a very general level, Trump means it. The problem is, you have this massive inconsistency between the rhetoric and the policy. American policy, you could say, is Israel first. We're backing Israel. Also, it's really amazing. You have this nationalism on the one hand. On the other hand, you have people holding the American flag and the Israeli and Ukrainian flag. And so it's a question of exactly who's in charge here, but is the question. So you have this issue of inconsistency. There are people on the right, by the way, who note this. Tucker Carlson, immensely influential.
Yes.
Talking head, basically, on the right. Somebody very much pro-Trump for the most part. Very influential figure. And he himself has noted this inconsistency and has been very critical of U.S. support for Israel on nationalist grounds. That it's not in America's interest to do this. Trump is very much against foreign aid. He's been cutting foreign aid right and left. The biggest recipient of foreign aid is, and has always been, at least for decades, Israel. Israel received far more foreign aid under Biden, and now
Do you think foreign aid towards Israel is going to be cut as well?
I'm sorry, say again, too?
Sorry, I was saying, do you think foreign aid towards Israel is going to be cut down as well?
So far, it hasn't been. That's the key. The key is American massive subsidies to Israel. I don't have the exact figure. If I recall correctly, I think the annual figure, the regular figure, is $3.8 billion per year, and also extra subsidies during the war on a substantial scale. And this has been going on for decades, from Nixon's time, as I said, for half a century, more than half a century. And obviously, one of the things I'm very surprised nobody's raised as a political issue is, go to Youngstown, Ohio, go to Detroit, go to devastated cities in the Middle West and say, in a situation where people are miserable, where people are on dopamine of high debts, should American taxpayers be funding a high income country like Israel? Why are we doing that? Does that make any sense? In other words, the most effective way politically to present this is on nationalist grounds. Um, and if you want to raise it as an issue, I don't think a lot of my friends who are active in these types of things, I tend to emphasize human rights for the Palestinians, which is perfectly understandable. It's just that what's going on in Gaza, just the horrific mass killings, this famine, deaths of children, and so on, is absolutely sickening. I don't think that really works in terms of a strategy of influencing people. I think what really works, people would say that's far away. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't really even understand what's going on over there. I don't have time to understand. And
Yeah.
if you're working at Walmart or something, it's understandable that people don't have time for this kind of thing. But I think what would really be very effective is, why on earth are we paying for it? We're using taxpayer money to fund this. So far, nobody seems to have discovered that as a campaign issue, but I think that's something waiting in the wings for somebody to discover. When it does happen, I think it's going to be very explosive in character.
I think so. I'm also wondering, so a lot of analysts, a lot of guests that I've had on this show before are of the opinion that um, things will never go back for Israel, and they put themselves into this situation where um, they they used to be able to climb up the escalation ladder and have that aggressive kind of policy previously, but they won't be able to maintain that long term. We're seeing attacks by Yemen, by Iran. I mean, if Israel cannot block attacks from Yemen, how is it likely to block attacks coming in from Iran if that ever happens, for example? And then there's all of these citizens leaving the country, whether they'll ever come back or not,
Right.
economic problems. So there's all sorts of problems in the future. But even if we ignore all of those, I'm interested from your conversation to think about, if we look at the geopolitics that is changing outside of the control of Israel, and how the world is becoming a multipolar place. So within that, the establishments in Israel, are they now thinking about whether how much they can rely on USA in the future? And because you talked about how once they used to rely on Russia and then it went to France and then it went to America. So are Israelis now actually seriously thinking that who would be the next backer if the backing from America could they cannot rely solely on America anymore?
I find it hard to believe that Israel would ever see a situation, or could imagine a situation which is not being backed by the United States. There's a lot of hubris here,
Mm.
and a lot of sense of since we can get away with anything. Netanyahu, I think, his view is that he can manipulate the Americans endlessly. Let me say this: I would never count Netanyahu out. He seems to have 9 lives. He's like a cat, and every time people count him out, he seems to come back again and again and again. This happened since the 90s, and everybody thought that the attacks of October 7th would devastate his credibility, and he's still there.
Yeah,
I think most Israelis detest him, but he's still there.
yeah,
And I think that he's very smart,
yeah,
and he's very manipulative. And he seems to basically, and he understands the United States. When you hear him speak, he speaks English with an American accent. He spent much of his childhood in the United States. His father was a professor at Cornell, I believe. And he believes he can twist the Americans around his finger.
mm,
And to some extent, I think it's not that simple, as I said, because the Americans, I think, see Israel as a model of what American policy should be, and as a perfect ally, and so on. There's a neoconservative movement that grew up during this period, which I can discuss a bit if you'd like, which grew up in the 1970s, and one of their signature issues was that America should be more like Israel.
yeah.
Rock solid U.S. support for Israel was one of their signature characteristics. And so I don't think it's quite so simple, but the way Netanyahu sees it, I think, just trying to read his mind, which I don't think in this case is very difficult. He sees an endless ability to manipulate one president after another, and he can manipulate Trump just like he manipulated Biden and get away with it, one thing after another. And one thing that I think is going to be very difficult for Israel is immigration. You've had significant immigration, not even before the recent war, but now accelerated with the war. One thing Israel has had over several decades now are Israelis, educated Israelis, getting two passports. It's become increasingly easy for Jews with German or I believe Polish backgrounds to get German or Polish dual citizenship and thereby EU working rights. Many of them have obtained American or Canadian passports. And so even those who stay in Israel have this in their back pocket as their escape hatch, so to speak. And many of them have been using it during the war as things have deteriorated, both economically and politically, and have become more dangerous. And it's the most talented people, the best educated, naturally, who leave. Those are the ones with the most options. That will fundamentally undermine Israel's ability to be economically productive in the future. They're the startup nation. They have all these software firms. Yeah. That could just be very, very hard to sustain over time. And I think I remember 15 years ago, I read an article in an Israeli newspaper, I forget which one, and Haaretz, I think, in which there was a mathematician of the University of Haifa who commented on how in international mathematics competitions, Israeli children don't do especially well. They have mediocre results. And he said the reason is we haven't invested very heavily in mathematics education because too much money is spent on the military. It's very hard, and this is years ago. It's very hard to maintain Israel as a startup country if you have that kind of situation. And it's getting worse and worse over time. So I think this is going to be a problem that will be irresolvable for Israel. Yeah. And eventually, as I said, despite what Netanyahu believes, I do believe the American public will tire of financing Israel like this.
Because I'm also wondering, since Israel's inception, since they've been relying on USA has been a country that's been ascending in world politics. But now, for the first time, it's going to be, in relative terms, it's not going to be ascending if it's not descending. We have other powers, China, Russia, BRICS, are coming forward. So in that kind of scenario, even if they have the support of the USA, but USA hasn't got the power and the influence in the Middle East, they will have to be a neighborly country with their neighbors at the very least. This whole policy of constant aggression and bullying will have to change.
Well, there's no doubt you are seeing a decline of U.S. power. You've been seeing this for a long time. I think both Biden and Trump have put their foot in the accelerator. Biden, by what in my view was unnecessarily allowing a war in Ukraine to start that could have been civil negotiation. I'll be very frank and say I think the war was provoked by the United States, even though Russia should not have invaded, that the provocation, the evidence of this is absolutely overwhelming. And the United States thought that we'd be able to destroy Russia as a great power and also send a shot across the bow to China that we can do this to you as well. It's had the opposite effect, of course. We're losing that war. We will lose that war. And there's nothing like losing a war to undermine your credibility. And that's exactly what's happening here. And so that's going to accelerate American decline. Backing Israel in things that are universally acknowledged to be violations of international humanitarian law, mass killing of civilians and so on. This undermines, with complete American backing, all right, this undermines any pretense America has had as a sort of moral leader in the world or a defender of the rules-based order, as people like Tony Blinken sort of self-righteously like this claim. Nobody's going to take that seriously. I don't think people were taking that seriously for a long time, but now I think they'll take it even less seriously than before. Then the Donald Trump tariffs, of course, are undermining America's global role economically. The sanctions being imposed on Russia, being imposed on, seems like half the world, basically. This undermines America's economic credibility, the role of the dollar, and so on. All this is happening, will take time to fully play out, but I think the die is cast. I think it's already happening. I think we're going to see increasingly countries when they have to decide, in the past, it seemed like you had to deal with the United States. It's the unipolar country. It makes all the rules. That's not true anymore. And countries that are feeling unhappy with the United States, they will be able to deal with other countries, led by China, but not just China, many other countries as well. Okay. And so America's role in the Middle East, undoubtedly, is declining and will continue to decline to Israel's detriment. And that can't be stopped.
Also, so if you look at like the greater region of West Asia, there's so many borders that are conflicted. There's also a lot of the divisions that happen when creating states in the Middle East. A lot of the divisions are very unnatural, causing problems, but also people like the Kurds, split into four, all of these things, how much impact has that had in stability of the region as a whole? But how big a problem is that going to be going forward as well in terms of the stability of the whole region?
Well, there's no doubt there's huge rivalries throughout the Middle East. The most obvious one, of course, which goes back all the way to the days of the Shah, is Iran versus Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
as to which is the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. Now, from one to further afield, basically, there's long-standing tensions between Jordan, Syria, Turkey. One can go on and on. Um, and so this is going to accelerate, I think, over time.
Yeah.
And one of the things again that has accelerated has been American intervention. The war on terror, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, played a significant role in destabilizing Syria, with catastrophic effects of that country. It also destabilized Europe, I might add. Waves of immigrants pouring into Europe, which rightly or wrongly are seen negatively by many working class people in Europe, led to Brexit, the incipient breakup of the European Union. It led to the rise of the AfD in Germany, the right-wing party of Germany. It's having all sorts of destabilizing effects in Europe. And so, once again, I'm not saying American foreign policy is the only factor. Obviously, it's not. But U.S. foreign policy has been a significant factor on destabilizing the region, I would say.
How also do you see a lot of people look at the Middle East and say that there's like a revival of Islam going on, not just in religious terms, but politically, culturally. Um, a lot of the secularist kind of parties, governments have gone or are on the way out. So how do you kind of see that from a civilizational point of view?
I can't really comment on that. I mean, I would say from a political point of view, the way I would see that is the decline of the left in the Muslim world. There may be a number of reasons for this, but one reason, again, focusing on my parochial interest in U.S. foreign policy, is U.S. foreign policy. That covert operations basically undermine things like the Tudeh party of Iran over decades. And because there was no Tudeh party to oppose the Shah, naturally it was the Islamists who opposed the Shah. Somebody had to do it. And they were the only people left, effectively. The Shah himself, of course, Savak, was especially hard on the left, harder on the left than he was on the Islamists. I think this is true in many countries. The Israelis, for example, basically were promoting Hamas, openly promoting Hamas as an alternative to the secularists. First the Marxists, but then the secularists. And so I think that the U.S. foreign policy, and to some extent Israeli foreign policy, has been a significant force in destroying the left throughout the Muslim world. And without an active left, basically, serving as an opposition, the only people that are available to do this are the Islamists. Yeah. So that's how I would see the rise of Islam. But again, that's a partial view, reflecting the fact that at a cultural level, I really don't have a very deep understanding of Islam.
I think it's also interesting what's going on in Syria, and I think long term they're going to find out, Israel, America, that it was a mistake to do what they did with Bashar al-Assad and his government, and we're seeing what that's been replaced by. You studied Afghanistan, I've studied Afghanistan quite a bit as well. I just see another Afghanistan being created next door to Turkey. So Pakistan being next door to Afghanistan has suffered a huge blowback from that whole long civil war. So
Afghanistan, I know about, yeah.
Yeah, so I can't believe that Turkey, I mean, what role USA as well played is one thing, but I can't understand how Turkey allowed this situation to be developed right on their borders.
It's very short-sighted. You think Turkey would have interest in stability on their borders. I mean, any reasonable country would want stability on their borders. Why would you want anything else? But that seems Erdogan, basically, out of there may be other reasons. Clearly there's some degree of, I don't know, great power megalomania, perhaps, shall we say?
Yes, to show personal dislike, exactly.
Yeah, it's so I think that's a factor. People may, in the end, miss Assad, and I say that recognizing Assad did have a very brutal background and a very brutal record. That's undeniable. But it's very possible. We still don't fully know, but it's very possible what is going to replace him could be even worse.
Yes.
All right. That's exactly what happened in Afghanistan.
Yes.
When you had basically the pro-Soviet regime, the PDPA, which actually wasn't that bad by the end. All right. Towards the latter part of after the Soviets left, they became quite moderate. And I think they even gained some significant popular support, but they overthrown in 1992. with, of course, U.S. support as well as Pakistani support, lots of Pakistani support, in fact. And what happened was a disaster for the people of Afghanistan and the people of the world, because, of course, out of that came Al-Qaeda, out of that came the Taliban, out of that came the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Destabilization always produces blowback,
Yes.
as Chalmers Johnson, the political scientist, noted. And that blowback can be devastating for the country that perpetrated the destabilization. And Israel's finding that out. We found that out in Afghanistan. Pakistan, no doubt, itself is finding it, destabilizing Pakistan domestically. I suspect in time, Turkey will find that out too. We'll find it out
So
hard.
I think because a lot of the circumstances are very similar. The fact that there's no one dominant kind of religion or ethnic sect in Syria, which allows a lot of the regional countries to pick and choose who they want to support. At the moment, I think not just in Syria, but all over Middle East, Israel's very busy supporting minorities because it's trying to create like a bulwark against the Shia kind of crescent. So I think that's having an impact not just in Syria, but in Iraq and all of these other places. So
Really
what happened in Afghanistan took decades for us to get through that whole process to just get to where we are now. So I can see that's going to be playing out in Syria as well.
Yes, I think that we've already seen these massacres basically that have occurred after the overthrow of Assad, which was not boding well for the future. We saw basically in Libya, of course, there was the overthrow of Gaddafi,
Yes.
who had a mixed record. He certainly was repressive, although he did have some accomplishments as well that can't be denied.
Yeah.
And whatever you may think of Gaddafi, what happened since then is much worse, not only for the people of Libya, but the whole region. It triggered secondary civil wars in Niger, where I served in the Peace Corps, by the way, so it affected me directly, as well as Mali. North Korea probably looked at this and noted that they never will give up their nuclear weapons now, because after all, Gaddafi did give up his nuclear program in exchange for American and British agreement, basically, to stop trying to overthrow him. And he kept his side of the bargain. Look what happened to him. Look what happened in person.
That was such a lost opportunity for the West, because they should have embraced him after that to create a precedence to show these other countries that you can give up your weapons of mass destruction and be part of the global community.
That's right. That's right. And people just sort of threw that whole thing away.
Yeah.
And it'll have a very negative effect on the Korean Peninsula and worldwide, because lots of people will look what happened to Gaddafi. He gave up his nuclear weapons. If he had nuclear weapons, they wouldn't have done that to him. That's
exactly. And now Israel saying for Iran, they want a Libya type deal. Well, of course they do, but Iran's not going to go for that.
It's incredible, the aggressive language that the United States and its allies like Israel use, and that they would say things like that. Imagine if Iran were to say that about Israel. It's a little bit also, it reminds me just as a sort of double standard here. American and European leaders freely talk about, well, let's break up Russia, let's overthrow the regime, we'll have regime change, we'll make it a vassal state, we'll destroy it as a country, we'll make the ruble into rubble. I mean, imagine if Putin were to talk about the United States or European countries that way. Anyway,
I think you're right. From that point of view, Russia's shown so much restraint.
It has, I think, more restraint than I think the United States would have done. Again, the obvious question is, what would the United States have done if Russia and or China were setting up military bases in Mexico? Everyone knows what the U.S. would do. Everyone knows.
Yes. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this discussion. I'd love to have you back another day. There's so many other regions that I'm so interested in, and I'd love to get your thoughts on what's going on in Sudan, but the role of Europe in days to come. And then, of course, we have BRICS. I'd love to have you back one day. Before we go, would you like to, is there any social media or anything where people can follow you? If you share this with me, I can put them in a link.
If you go to my website, which has all the information about me, it's dgibbs, DGIBBS, .Arizona, spelled out, Arizona.edu, dgibbs.arizona.edu.
Brilliant. I'll also put down the notes where people can connect with you. But thank you so much, David. I'd love to have you back one day.
It'd be a pleasure. Thank you, Tafim. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.